It all started on a regular Tuesday. Ryan had come home early from work, wincing as he walked through the door. He was trying to hide the pain, but I could see it. I could always see it. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled, and his right arm was wrapped in a sling. I didn't ask what happened, I already knew. Another accident at work, another injury to add to the list. The same story, just a different chapter. Ryan had always been a hard worker. In fact, he had always been the one to carry the weight of our household. He was proud of his job as a contractor, taking on tough projects that kept him on his feet for hours, doing physical labor day in and day out. But now, with this latest injury, it felt like he couldn't do anything. He couldn't work, couldn't lift, couldn't be the man he once was. And that frustrated me more than I liked to admit. At first, I tried to be supportive. I cooked his meals, helped him get comfortable on the couch, and listened to him complain about the long recovery he had ahead of him. But it wasn't just the physical toll it took on him. It was the way it affected our lives. His injury left us financially strained, and I had to pick up the slack. I worked longer hours at my job, trying to make up for the lost income, but the pressure started to weigh on me. There were bills to pay, groceries to buy, and I was doing it all alone. And all the while, Ryan's sense of worth seemed to slip further away. He was angry, bitter, and I could feel his resentment growing every day. One evening, after another long day of juggling work and taking care of him, I sat down to dinner with a couple of friends. They could see the exhaustion in my eyes and knew something was wrong. But I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted to forget for just a little while. So, instead, I made light of the situation, trying to make myself laugh at the absurdity of it all. You know, I said, picking at my food, trying to sound casual, I think I'm starting to understand what people mean when they say their husbands are useless. Ryan's been out of commission for weeks, and I'm doing everything, working, taking care of the house, and being the sole breadwinner. I might as well be doing it alone. My friends laughed, and I laughed too, even though deep down, I felt guilty. It wasn't like I didn't care. It wasn't like I didn't understand that Ryan was hurting. But at that moment, I was just so overwhelmed by everything that I couldn't help but joke about it. It was easier that way. If I could laugh, then maybe the weight of it all wouldn't feel so heavy. But little did I know, Ryan had overheard me. Later that night, when I came home, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the television, his body tense. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. I could feel the anger radiating off of him. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low. I froze, my heart sinking in my chest. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I had a feeling I knew where this was going. "About me, being useless," he continued, his eyes now burning with hurt. "Is that how you really feel?" I tried to explain myself, to apologize, but the words didn't come out right. I had meant it as a joke, a way to cope with the stress. But to him, it wasn't funny. He was injured, vulnerable, and feeling like less of a man every day, and now his wife was publicly mocking him. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the disappointment in his face. I had wounded him in a way that I couldn't undo with a simple apology. He didn't say anything more that night. He just turned away from me, pulling the covers up and shutting me out. And from that moment on, things were different. The walls between us seemed higher, thicker. The connection that we once had started to erode, and I didn't know how to fix it. What was meant to be a harmless joke had fractured something deep inside him, and I was left wondering if I could ever get it back. The days after that conversation felt like a slow, suffocating crawl. I had hoped, naively, that the tension would fade, that things would go back to normal. But nothing ever did. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing day, and I could feel the distance between Ryan and me widening more and more. We didn't fight. We didn't shout or argue. It was worse than that. We just didn't talk. At first, I tried to approach him, tried to make things right. I apologized again, more earnestly this time, telling him that I never meant to hurt him, that it was a stupid joke. But his response was always the same, a stiff nod or a tired shrug, as if he couldn't find the energy to even engage with me. It was like he had closed himself off, pulling into a shell I couldn't break through. One night, I went into the living room, trying to start a conversation. He was sitting there, as usual, staring blankly at the TV, his body hunched over. I asked him how he was feeling, if the pain was getting any better. He responded with a short, "Fine," but it was clear that the words didn't carry any weight. I could tell he wasn't fine, he hadn't been fine for a while. But instead of opening up, instead of sharing his frustrations or fears, he just withdrew. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see how deeply this had affected him. Ryan was no longer the man I had married, the strong, confident, capable man who had always taken care of everything. The injury had taken that from him, but it wasn't just the physical pain that was hurting him. It was his pride, his sense of self-worth. He couldn't work anymore, couldn't contribute in the way he was used to. He felt useless, and I could see that the joke I had made was the straw that broke the camel's back. I couldn't blame him. I had made a careless, hurtful comment, and I could see now how it had eaten away at him, eating into the core of his confidence. I tried to be patient, but the frustration and guilt inside me were building, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it in. At the same time, I felt myself becoming resentful. I was doing everything now, working extra hours, taking care of the house, handling all the bills. And while Ryan sat on the couch, recovering, I could sense the shift in our relationship. It wasn't just the lack of conversation, it was the emotional distance. He had stopped confiding in me. The man who used to tell me everything, who would laugh with me about the stupidest things, was gone. Now, he was a stranger sitting beside me, barely acknowledging my presence. I began to resent him for not opening up, for not allowing me to help him in the way that I wanted to. I tried to be understanding, to remind myself that this injury wasn't his fault. But as the days dragged on, I found it harder and harder to maintain the facade of patience. I started to feel alone, stuck in this marriage where the man I had once leaned on was now the one who seemed incapable of providing any support, emotionally or otherwise. It was like we were both trapped in this limbo, neither of us knew how to move forward, how to heal from the wounds that had been created. And all the while, my guilt over the joke continued to eat at me, making it even harder to break through the walls Ryan had built around himself. Every attempt I made to fix things felt like it only pushed him further away, and the silence between us grew louder. It didn't take long before the cracks in our relationship became too obvious to ignore. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. I tried to fill it with meaningless small talk, offering to cook his favorite meals or asking if he wanted to watch something on TV, but every attempt felt forced. Ryan no longer seemed interested in anything I had to say. It was like I had become a stranger to him, and he had become a stranger to me. The man I had married, the man I had loved, was slowly slipping away. I started spending more time at work, not because I wanted to, but because it was easier. The office was a place where I could breathe, a place where I could feel like I still had some control over my life. It was a temporary escape, but it was an escape nonetheless. The longer I stayed away from home, the more I found myself dreading coming back. What would I walk into this time? Another cold, silent evening, with Ryan lost in his thoughts, unwilling to engage. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. I still loved him. At least, I thought I did. But with each passing day, I couldn't help but wonder if I was still the same person he had fallen in love with. I wasn't sure if he still loved me either. If he did, he wasn't showing it. His affection had dried up, replaced by an air of indifference. The jokes we once shared, the light-hearted moments we used to enjoy together, were all gone. One evening, I came home late, exhausted from another long day at work. The house was dark, and I couldn't hear any noise coming from the living room. I walked into the kitchen and found Ryan sitting at the table, staring at his hands. The sling was still on his arm, a constant reminder of how helpless he felt. He didn't look up when I walked in, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I had never felt so disconnected from him. "Ryan," I said softly, trying to break the silence. "We need to talk." He didn't answer, but I saw his shoulders tense. He was waiting for me to say something, something that would fix everything, or at least make him feel better. But I didn't have the right words. What could I say to repair the damage? How could I take back the hurt I had caused with that stupid joke? I sat down across from him, watching him as he stared into space. His face was hard, like he had built up walls around himself that no one could break through. I knew he was angry, but more than that, he was hurting. I could see it in his eyes, the frustration, the sadness. And yet, I couldn't seem to reach him. "I never meant to hurt you," I said, my voice trembling. "I know I made a mistake. But, Ryan, this isn't just about the joke anymore. It's about everything else. We're drifting apart, and I don't know how to fix it." He didn't respond right away, but I could tell he was thinking, weighing his words carefully. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked at me. His eyes were tired, defeated, and I could see the pain etched across his face. "I don't know how to fix it either," he said quietly. "I don't know if I can anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He was giving up, I realized. He didn't believe we could fix this, not after everything that had happened. The sense of hopelessness in his voice made my heart break. "I don't want to give up," I whispered. "I don't want to lose you." But Ryan just shook his head, his gaze falling back to the table. "It's not just you, though, is it? It's me. I can't even take care of myself anymore, let alone be the man I used to be for you." His words stung. The man I had loved, the man I had depended on, was so lost in his own pain that he couldn't see how much I still needed him. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just about what he could do for me, that I loved him for who he was, not just his ability to provide. But the words caught in my throat. How could I explain that, when it felt like the love we once shared was slipping through my fingers? We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the distance between us growing wider with every passing second. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know how to reach him, how to make him see that I wasn't going anywhere. But as I sat there, staring at the man I had once called my partner, I realized something. This wasn't just about the injury, or the joke, or the way our lives had changed. It was about us. It was about finding a way back to each other, before it was too late. But I wasn't sure we still knew how to do that. One evening, after another strained dinner in silence, I made a decision. I needed to get away, even if only for a few hours. I couldn't keep hiding from the mess that my life had become, but I also couldn't face it head-on every single moment. I needed a distraction. I called up an old friend, Laura, who had been there for me during the good times and the bad. She was a safe place, someone who could remind me of who I was before all this turmoil started. I told Ryan I was going out for a bit. He barely acknowledged me, just a grunt in response. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by relief as I stepped outside. The cool evening air hit my face, and for the first time in a while, I felt a flicker of freedom. I wasn't sure if I was running away from my problems or simply trying to breathe, but either way, I needed this. I met Laura at a small cafe in the city. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy corner place with mismatched chairs and an old jukebox in the corner. It was the kind of place where you could sit for hours, sipping coffee and talking about nothing at all. When I walked in, Laura waved at me from a corner booth, her face lighting up when she saw me. It was comforting to see someone who didn't look at me with pity or judgment, someone who simply cared. We talked for hours, catching up on everything we had missed. At first, I tried to avoid the subject of Ryan, but eventually, it came up. Laura could tell something was off. She had known me long enough to see the cracks in my smile, the way my eyes had lost that spark they used to have. "So, what's going on with you and Ryan?" she asked, gently pushing me to open up. I sighed, staring down at my coffee cup. I don't know, I admitted. It's like we're both just here. But we're not really together anymore. I hurt him, Laura. I made a joke about him being useless, and it's like everything just shattered. He doesn't talk to me anymore. He's withdrawn, and I feel like I'm living with a stranger. Laura nodded, understanding the weight of what I was saying. You know, sometimes the smallest things can break the strongest relationships, she said quietly. You have to be honest with him, Emma. Tell him how you feel. Tell him you're sorry, really sorry. I looked at her, unsure. But what if he doesn't care anymore? What if he's already given up on us? You won't know unless you try, she replied. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you still love him, you have to fight for it. Her words resonated with me, echoing in my mind long after our conversation ended. I left the cafe that night feeling a bit lighter, but also more conflicted than ever. I knew I couldn't continue living in this limbo, and I had to make a choice. But what if my efforts were in vain? What if Ryan truly didn't want to fix things? What if I had already lost him? I went back home that night, my heart heavy with uncertainty. I opened the door quietly, not wanting to disturb Ryan. He was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV again, but this time, something was different. There was a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or sadness, on his face when he glanced at me. It was the first time in weeks that I saw him look at me like he cared. I stood there, frozen for a moment. I wanted to say everything I had been holding back, to tell him how much I still loved him, how sorry I was for everything. But before I could speak, Ryan broke the silence. Maybe we need to talk, he said quietly. His words were unexpected, but they were a spark of hope. Perhaps there was still a chance for us. Maybe it wasn't too late to fix the mess I had made. But only time would tell if we could truly find our way back to each other. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Ryan and I didn't immediately dive into the heart of the conversation that had been hanging over us for weeks. We took baby steps, awkward but necessary. He had agreed to talk, but neither of us was ready for the floodgates to open just yet. Instead, we spent time together in silence, yet, it wasn't as uncomfortable as before. We watched a movie, something light and silly, the way we used to. There was no heavy conversation, no painful silence, it was just us, sitting side by side. But as the days went by, the tension between us started to fade. Ryan seemed more present, more engaged, like he wasn't just physically there, but emotionally too. We both had our guards up, but I could see in his eyes that he was trying. I was trying too, in my own way, learning to be more patient with myself and with him. The walls we had both built were slowly crumbling, piece by piece. Then, one evening, after dinner, Ryan turned to me. He had that look on his face, the same one he used to wear when he wanted to talk about something important. I could feel my heart race, a mix of hope and fear flooding my chest. Emma, he began, his voice hesitant but steady, I know things have been hard. I've been angry and hurt. But I also know that I'm not the only one to blame here. You didn't cause all this. It wasn't just your joke. I swallowed, a lump forming in my throat. His words were more than I expected. They were the beginning of something, an understanding, a healing. I nodded, unsure of what to say, but wanting him to know that I was listening. I've been holding on to this resentment, he continued. It's been eating at me. I've felt useless, like I can't be the man you deserve. But the truth is, I've been letting my injury control me. I've been hiding behind it. And that's not fair to you. I reached for his hand, a simple gesture, but it felt like the most profound thing I could do in that moment. His hand was warm, and for the first time in so long, it felt like we were connected again. I'm sorry, I said, my voice trembling. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. I never wanted to make you feel worthless. You're not useless, Ryan. I didn't know how to deal with everything, and I took it out on you. We sat there in silence for a moment, but this time, it was a peaceful silence. We didn't need to say anything else. We both knew where we stood. We still had work to do, but the important thing was that we were willing to try. The next few weeks were filled with small changes. We started talking more openly, even about the uncomfortable things, the hurt, the resentment, the fears. We were no longer afraid of the truth. And as we did, I realized that the bond between us was stronger than I had given it credit for. It wasn't about being perfect, or never making mistakes, it was about the willingness to grow, to change, and to fight for each other. One night, as we sat together on the couch, laughing about a ridiculous TV show, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. We had come so far since that first awkward conversation. There was still work ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about our future. "I'm glad we're still here," I said quietly, looking over at Ryan. He smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. "Me too," he replied, squeezing my hand. "We're not perfect, but we're still us. And that's enough." In that moment, I knew that while the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, we had the strength to face it together. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed that we could make it through, that we could start anew.